Good evening, everyone. This is question 6 from homework 7, and this is from the ABS math class. That's math 1324 combined with 0324. This is a fraction equation. Now, a lot of people get scared of fractions because, oh my gosh, fractions. But fractions are numbers just like anything else. I know that a lot of students will say, well, I know I can convert a fraction to a decimal, and I'm happy with that. But a fraction like -7/6 that we see in this equation here doesn't convert nicely to a decimal. If I did something like that, do you see how I get a repeating decimal, -1.166666 repeating? You don't want to deal with numbers like that. And so a big part of what I do in this class is it's okay to have fractions. It's okay to work with fractions when I need them. I know that I would feel okay if these were whole numbers to say what I do to one side of this equation I do to the other. I can do the same thing here. For example, I am allowed to subtract 2 from both sides of this equation, because if I do that, the plus 2 and the minus 2 would cancel out. Right? And I'm left with a fraction minus a whole number, 25/2 minus 2. The good part about this class is that we are allowed to use a calculator, like this Desmos calculator. I'm going to just type in 25 divided by 2. You can see it enters a fraction, and I use my arrow key to get out of that fraction. 25/2 minus 2 is this decimal. I'll click here to make that into a fraction. 25/2 minus 2 is 21/2. And as weird as that sounds, it is perfectly fine to leave that number as a fraction. So -7/6 y equals 21/2. Again, if this were like a college algebra class, a math 13-14 class, I would be lecturing you about how to make sure everything is common denominators. You need to convert them, therefore they're always the same. And that's actually a good topic to know. If you feel comfortable with that topic, do that. Right? Nobody likes to rely on a calculator for something you don't understand how to do without the calculator. Because if that happens, then we just have to take the calculator's word for it like it's magic. I don't like that. But that doesn't mean we have to do it every time ourselves by hand. -7/6y equals 21/2. And as weird as this sounds, I'm about to divide by a fraction. -7/6. And oh my gosh, look at this. It's a fraction divided by a fraction. How am I going to enter something like that into my Desmos calculator? When you need a complicated fraction divided by fraction going on, I recommend that you press the divide key first, which will give you a fraction first. Then inside of that fraction, you can press 21/2 to get a fraction inside of that fraction. And it looks really weird, but Desmos is going to handle this perfectly fine. And if you have a Casio calculator, it will handle it perfectly fine as well. Divided by -7. Forgot about -7. -7/6. And wouldn't you know it, it gives me the answer is equal to -9. Now, how did I do that? Why did that work? We'll be able to look at that in a few different ways in just a moment. But for now, if you came here only looking for what is the result and how do I get it in the fastest way possible, I would recommend a calculator which can handle fraction computations. If you wanted to check this answer, you could go back and plug it into the original equation, -7/6 times y. Oops. I'll do that here in my calculator. -7/6 times the y value, which is -9, 10.5, or as a fraction, 21/2. And then, well, we take that. Oh, I guess I should have done plus 2. Sorry. I didn't type in everything on the left side of that equation. All of that equals 25 over 2, which is exactly what we were looking for it to equal. And so I know this is correct. Right? So again, it's a quick and dirty way to get an answer when you have access to a calculator. But that's not the only way to look at this problem, and that's not the only way to proceed with the fraction operations. So if you have a little bit more time, I highly recommend looking at this in several different ways, because you might find a different way to be more intuitive for you and more comfortable for you. I'm going to scroll down and do the same problem a different way. So I'll start over, brand new equation, same problem. -7 over 6y plus 2 equals 25 over 2. Let me, instead of adding 2, subtracting 2, I'm going to get rid of all of these fractions first. How do I get rid of the fractions? Well, I know that if I multiplied times 2, it would get rid of this fraction on the right. I know if I multiplied times 6, it would get rid of this fraction on the left. And you can, if you've worked with common denominators before, you might see where this is going, right? Maybe an earlier algebra teacher would say, oh, well, 6 is a multiple of 2. So every time that you multiply times 6, you are multiplying times 2, and then again times 3. But again, remember, this is a business math class. I'm not going to be the one saying, well, finding that common denominator is always the fastest and easiest way. So instead of that, let me instead do this. I'm going to multiply times all of the denominators that I see, because if I multiply times 6, it will cancel out with one fraction. And if I multiply times 2, it's going to cancel out times the other fraction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply every fraction times 6 times 2. Right? That's times 12 really total. But I'm going to show it is times 6 times 2 times 6 times 2 times 6 times 2. Essentially what I'm doing here is I'm distributing a times 12 everywhere. Right? But if this were a different math class, I would have a big set of parentheses and do times 12. But again, I'm trying to make things as simple as possible, or at least as the least complex as possible. I see that when I multiply the times 6 times this first fraction, cancels out that fraction. When I multiply the last fraction times 2, cancels out the times 2. What's left is to multiply what remains. So in the first term, -7y times 2, multiplying times 2 is not so bad. That's -14y. All the fractions are gone there. The next term, the plus 2, gets multiplied times 6 times 2, and 2 times 6 times 2 is, what, 24? I'm just going to check that. 24. You know what you're thinking, Professor, aren't you paid to know how to do that in your head? I am, and I can, but this is not the time for me to show off. The fraction on the right, 25 over 2, did cancel out with one of the 2's. 25 times 6, I believe it's 150. But we're going to check that with our calculator. Equals 150. Now this equation is whole numbers only. Much easier to deal with. As a matter of fact, you might look at this equation now and say, I can deal with this equation now as I see it. So let me work from here. I know that I should subtract 24 from both sides of this equation. 24 minus 24 is 0. 150 minus 24 is 126. 126. -14y equals -126. And I can divide by -14. You can see why it's not time to show off for me, right? I'm asking my calculator what is 126 divided by negative 14? That equals 9. Negative 9. I get the same result. Y equals negative 9. And really, after that first step of multiplication, there are no more fractions involved. And I know that maybe your earlier algebra teachers would have said, really, you should only multiply times the 6 because that is the least common denominator or least common multiple. As long as you do your divisions correctly, in the end, it all will cancel out in the end. The numbers may be bigger, but they are still correct. That's the wonderful part about equations. And so you can work this problem one of several different ways and get the same result, whatever you're most comfortable with. Have a good evening, everyone.